Well, in this segment, let's look at the role of Hitler and Stalin as leaders and the effects of the resulting command climate on military effectiveness and innovation. What was Stalin really like as a military leader?
Let me just make an observation before we talk about Stalin and Hitler, and that applies to both of them, and that is that when you ask what were they like as leaders, you have to put it in the context they faced themselves. If you are able to, if you're on the offensive, you have the initiative, you're winning and successful, it's easy to be tolerant of subordinate mistakes, it's easy to allow subordinate initiative and things like that. But when your back's to the wall and you think you're about to lose, then the natural instinct, I think, of everyone is to micromanage more. And that's what happened to Stalin. Remember, Stalin begins the war with the Red Army literally falling apart faster than he could even understand what was happening. So he starts the war convinced that most or all of his subordinates are, if not traitors, at least incompetent, and therefore he tries to manage everything himself. And during that period of time, being in the Red Army, particularly as the leader, was not fun. Any mistake was likely to get you relieved and imprisoned, if not shot. But then, gradually over time, in 1941-42, Stalin develops more confidence, first in a small group of his leaders, which he uses almost like fire brigades and sends them out to supervise things he trusts, people like Zhukov. And then later in the entire officer corps by the fall of 1942. And he's willing to then give them the initiative and subordinate mission command approach, if you will, that we always think of.
How would you portray Hitler as a military leader?
Well, Hitler, of course, is the reverse situation. At the beginning of the war, he's got success. Things are working the way they've wanted it to work in his previous campaigns. Everything seems to be working very well, and therefore he generally trusted his subordinates, followed their advice, permitted subordinate initiative, did what they wanted to do. Even if occasionally he would say, I want you to do this, they would give him military reasons why I don't think we should do this, and well, all right, do it your way. Critics tend to portray Hitler as sort of the ultimate toxic leader, to use a current term. And we have all these film clips that everybody's fond of where Hitler is screaming and spitting and throwing things at people and berating his subordinates. And that certainly happened, but it happened more later in the war, where again, as I said, his back is up against the wall. I sometimes know, we'll never know for sure, that he was simply trying to keep up his own nerve when he knew he was losing, but of course he would not admit that. And even if you recognize that Hitler has this reputation, he generally was probably insane by later in the war, that doesn't mean that he has always acts that way. In fact, he was very, very generous and courteous to his field commanders. A couple of examples. General Wolfram von Richthofen, who is the nephew of the famous Red Baron of World War I, was a German Air Force commander in World War II. In the fall of 1942, he asked for and got a personal interview with Hitler to complain about the way in which the Army was using Air Force assets, and he wanted more freedom to use his aircraft his way. And not only did Hitler hear him through and not yell and spit and throw things at him, but a few days later he promoted him to Field Marshal. Or take the most famous case, the source of a lot of this myth of Hitler as the interfering amateur is Erich von Manstein, the famous maneuver commander. And it is Manstein who tells us, if only the amateur had stayed in his corner, we, the professional staff officers, could have won the war somehow. But I would, if you actually look at the record, Manstein is an army group commander for Hitler for about 18 months, from the fall of 42, when Stalingrad falls apart, until the spring of 44. And during that period of time, he's constantly complaining and whining and carping. But initially, he is very, very successful. And so Hitler sort of tolerates that. There aren't any major accounts of Hitler throwing a fit with Manstein or anything else. But then, if your subordinate is constantly complaining and becomes less and less effective, eventually at some point you're going to say, why do I put up with this guy? And in March of 1944, Hitler finally decided he'd reached that point, both with Manstein and with another army group commander at the same time. But he didn't humiliate them, which is the traditional image we have of Hitler with his officers. No. He sent his personal aircraft to pick these two generals up, brought them to his headquarters, had a ceremony where he gave them a very high award, the source to the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, which is only the second possible highest award they had. thanked them publicly, said he didn't disagree with anything they had done, but that he needed a different kind of leader. He no longer needed a maneuver commander, he needed just somebody who could be stern and demand the maximum effort out of the troops. None of us want to be relieved, but if you have to be relieved, that's a very generous, polite way to do it. It doesn't line up with our image of Hitler as a toxic leader.
As the war progressed, Hitler's leadership underwent a true transformation. Can you provide any insight as to why and any impact?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is only conjecture because we don't know for sure, but looking at the summer and fall of 1942, I think is the pivotal era. Because during that period of time, Hitler has this sense that he's running out of his strategic window. He's running out of time. Whatever he might have thought of the United States and the Soviet Union in the previous year, when he declared war on the two greatest industrial powers in the world within 6 months of each other, by the fall of 42, he has to feel that if he doesn't quickly deal with the Soviets and get that oil out of the Caucasus, he's going to be overwhelmed by the combination of American and Soviet production, which, if you think about it, is largely what happened. So under those circumstances, in the second great campaign, the Operation Blau or Blue that starts at the end of June 1942, he becomes increasingly impatient. From his point of view, his commanders are being too cautious. They're dragging their heels. They're missing opportunities. The number of prisoners they take is far lower than it was the previous year. I suspect, cannot prove, this is just my theory if you will, that what was happening was the Red Army was so much better after a year of learning the hard way, sort of Darwinian survival, that after a year of that, the Red Army was, they still could be defeated by the Germans, but the Germans could no longer take risks. They had to be careful, they had to protect their flanks, they had to keep reserves and so on. And that was not visible, not only to Hitler, but even to his senior commanders in his headquarters. And therefore I think that he thought that they were dragging their heels, taking too much time, whereas in fact they were simply dealing with the tactical situation. So all right, if you take all those factors together, then he's going to be more and more impatient. What goes along with that is something that the other side of the story about Hitler interfering with staff work. You always hear people like Manstein complaining about Hitler will not let the general staff operate the way they want it to. They will not allow what we would today call mission command, but back up and look at what happens. The general staff method of operation requires a great deal of shared information so that everybody knows everybody else's situation and mission. What that also means, though, and I suspect we have this problem in the American Army occasionally, is that you have a great opportunity for operation security and information security violations. There are a number of famous incidents in the German Army. The one that everybody perhaps remembers is back in January of 1940, where a major with a complete set of the plans for invading Belgium and the Low Countries and France flew out in a light aircraft, got lost in the fog, landed in Belgium, and the plane was captured. Okay. Hitler put in various restrictions that said, don't ever do that again. All right, you go forward 17 months, and another major in the same kind of aircraft, this time he's only given a summary of the plan, which fulfills the letter of Hitler's directives, but not the spirit, does the same thing. He flies out over the Soviet lines, gets shot down, and the Soviets capture the plane. Fortunately for Hitler, Stalin thought no one would be this stupid. He thought it was a deception plan, that nobody would be that dumb as to take the whole plan and get themselves shot down. There are a whole number of there are other incidents that are less famous. But what that means is, from Hitler's point of view, they're consistently ignoring his directive about operational security. And so I think that's what's behind Hitler sort of tightening up control and saying, no, you don't need to know everything. You don't need to know what the guys on your left and right are doing. Just stay in your lane and follow orders. But that's not the way it's reported, of course, by his general.